the breakdown is we're talking about coordination, internal coordination, this unit. And the two systems that do that are the nervous system and the endocrine system. So endocrine system won't be till next semester. But nervous system, of course, is what we're dealing with. And nervous system, how it differs is that endocrines send hormones through the bloodstream to make this communication, to send these signals, versus the nervous system employs electrical and chemical means to send these signals directly to the cells on these nerves. Are you with me? Hormones versus electricity. So let's talk about the nervous system in particular. In summary, right? The nervous system gets information from the environment. It processes that information and figures out whether it's important, and then it gives instructions for a response to that information. Pretty straightforward. So our major divisions of the central nerve of the nervous system is there on page number 433 in your textbook. This figure 12.2 is a summary of all the next pieces that are coming here. All right? Because even though we have one nervous system, you can kind of break it into pieces. So the two major subdivisions are your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. If you look on page 432, on figure 12.1, they show you a picture of a person. And very clearly you can see that there are two kinds of divisions. The brain and the spinal cord are a certain color, and then all the rest of the other things are another color. You see what I'm talking about there? That's because the brain and spinal cord make up the central nervous system, or the CNS. Everything else, all the other nerves, all the ganglia, these guys make up the peripheral nervous system. The ganglion, which maybe is a term you've never heard before, that's basically this little swelling, this little knot-like piece in a nerve where the cell bodies are. You'll see when we talk about the nerves themselves, the cell bodies are kind of separate, and then the nerves have these dendrites and axons that move from them. So that these ganglion are places where the cell bodies are located, or more densely located than other places. So the peripheral nervous system, which again is not the brain or spinal cord, but everything else, all the other nerves, you can break that into two separate pieces, the sensory and the motor. The sensory is also called the afferent, or the motor is called the efferent. So what do sensory nerves do? They sense. Don't use the word to define the word, but yes, it's correct. They sense, right? They get information from out here and bring that information to where? The brain, the central nervous system, by way of the spinal cord, right? The spinal cord to the brain. Does that make sense? So they are sensing what's going on. And then they also have a motor division. What do you think the motor division is doing? Actually creating some sort of response, right? The muscles moving, the hormones being released from the glands and the endocrine system. We could keep going on. All the systems have some action that the nervous system controls. So we have, again, two pieces. So central and peripheral. We take the peripheral. We can break that into two pieces, right? The peripheral can be broken into the sensory and the motor, the afferent and the efferent. We can then take that afferent, the sensory division, and break it into two pieces. First, you have the somatic sensory division, and then you have the visceral sensory division. Now, when I say visceral, what does that word mean? Like organs? Yeah, like deep, gut, right? So this is the sensations of things that are happening in the viscera. Your heart, your lungs, your stomach, your bladder, these kind of things, right? The internal type stuff. Versus the somatic sensory division deals with the signals from all the places we've talked about so far. The skin, the bones, the muscles, the joints. Which basically, because that's all we've talked about as far as system-wise in the body. Does that make sense? So somatic is from the stuff we've already talked about, and visceral is the stuff that we haven't talked about yet. And again, notice that that is somatic sensory and visceral sensory, because then there's also a somatic motor and a somatic sensor, and a visceral motor. Does that make sense? And again, same divisions. Somatic meaning carrying signals to the skeletal muscles to actually allow them to contract or to move, or even just the involuntary contractions, and then which we call reflexes, which we'll talk more about those in the future. And then our visceral motor division, again, that's carrying the signals to the glands, to the cardiac muscle, to the smooth muscles. Does that make sense? So again, this chart here, not done, sorry, one more. We can then take this visceral motor division, which we also call the autonomic nervous system, right? Maybe you've heard of that before. This autonomic nervous system we can also break down into two more divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system, its main piece, and we're going to talk a whole lot more about the sympathetic nervous system, but the sympathetic nervous system is kind of engaged when somebody does this. And woke you up, right? Sorry if you were listening to that, I apologize. You got that quick, that jolt, right? Whew. Waking you up, see? It's good. And the point there is, it's good, it's good. Sorry if I triggered anybody, my apologies. You will never forget, that is your sympathetic nervous system you are feeling right now, okay? It's that fight or flight, right? Something has happened, something has, and it's arousing your body to action. Shh. Your textbook also puts this big piece that it inhibits digestion. Okay, because if you're running for your life, there's no need to process that cheeseburger you just ate, right? Okay, that makes sense. It's a little random to me, but okay. If you're exercising so much, you're saying, no. No, that's just your body's response to, I just can't handle anything else. I'm going to vomit this. No. This is not saying you will throw up. It's just saying you won't spend the energy on digesting because you're trying to run away or fight. Yeah, which is fine. It happens. Well, that would be a problem. You're correct. The opposite for the sympathetic would be the parasympathetic. The parasympathetic, again, is calming. So like some of you, I got you going there when I clapped my hands and yelled, right? Is your heart still going a little bit? Most of us, you've kind of caught, because there was no real danger. It was just Mr. Hess being goofy. Shh. Sir. Yeah. No. Maybe you're just not as jumpy. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you've been exposed to more things like that, that you've kind of desensitized to it. Perhaps, yeah, your system is just not as triggered responsive. I'm not sure there's a reason. Shh. Mm-hmm. No, sure, right. You're simply becoming adapted to it. You're used to understanding, hey, this is just a part of what I'm doing. Absolutely. Okay. Same pictures that were in your textbook. Shh. And this makes it seem like you've got a whole bunch of different nervous systems. You don't. But the nervous system just does a huge variety of things. Does that make sense? And so that's why we've broken into these smaller categories to help us understand more of those pieces. Yeah. Sure. Absolutely. Yes. I was curious. Did I get you?
I was expecting it.
Okay, because he knows. I do this every year with my classes, and I talk about parents. And I'll maybe do it again in the future. We'll see when we get close to that again. But so I was curious to ask if Alex, because he actually said, "Oh, I can't wait for you to do that," because right? Sure, sure. All right, moving on. I just don't tell them. Oh, yeah, I feel bad. Somebody, no, it's coming. Quick. Right. No, this is not a conscious decision. You're like, something is going to attack and kill me. I should probably get excited. No. It's an immediate release of the central nervous system causing this. Yep. All right. Whew. We're good? Our parasympathetic is working overtime to settle us down here. All right. So let's talk about 3 universal properties. Universal properties of nerves. Things that all neurons have. Okay? And we use neurons just about interchangeably. Okay? Neuron is a very specific type of cell. The nerve is a bundle of these neurons together. So, excitability, you should be able to respond to some stimulus. Conductivity. When I respond, I can send a signal, and usually that would be an electrical signal, down that neuron in order to communicate that to another cell. Okay? So, think about like a game of telephone, right? Or I were to whisper something here to Autumn, and she would tell, and she would tell, and he would tell, down the line, right? That's what we mean by conductivity, right? And last but not least, secretion. That when that signal that's been conducted to the very end of the neuron, when it reaches that end, it will release, it'll secrete a neurotransmitter that will then affect the next cell. What's the only neurotransmitter that we've talked about here? Do you remember? In the last chapter. It's ACH. That's the abbreviation. Acetylcholine. And that's the specific neurotransmitter between a nerve and a muscle. Okay, there are literally thousands of others, but this is the one we focused on in the nervous system. Okay? But every nerve has to be able to secrete some neurotransmitter to actually continue the signal on to other cells. We put neurons in some classes, not like to instruct them or make them more knowledgeable, but just to group them. And there are 3 of those classes. The first is the sensory class, or afferent, which again you realize that is the same words we use for the division of the systems, right? And again, what these guys' job are to detect stimuli, to bring information into the central nervous system. We have our motor or our efferent neurons. These guys are carrying out the signal, right? They are sending it to the muscles, to the glands. We call those the effectors because we're actually causing an effect, right? And last but not least, we have interneurons. When we say inter, we mean between, right? So these are the connections between the sensory and the motor. And these occur only in the central nervous system. Because again, every sensory nerve, like the sensory nerves in your fingers, comes up to the spinal cord, to your brain, to be interpreted by these interneurons, and then a signal is being sent back down on the motor or the efferent neurons. And again, this picture is there in your textbook on page 434. Does that make sense? Any questions there? Let's talk about how the actual neurons are structured. And I have simplified this quite a bit on your study guide. That basically, and we're looking at this picture that's there on page 435. If I roll down a bit, if it'll let me, I'm talking about this picture right here on page 435. The 3 big pieces I want you to be aware of. Why won't you go back up? Come on. There we go. The first is called the neurosoma, or the soma, is how I put it on your study guide. which that's just simply the cell body, right? The cell body has the nucleus. The cell body has all the mitochondria. The cell body has all of the cytoskeleton, the microtubules, all the stuff you need for a regular functioning cell that's carried there in that soma, in that cell body. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is. And again, your textbook uses them interchangeably. Some places they'll talk about motor neurons. Sometimes they'll talk about efferent neurons. Yeah. So just, yeah, E versus afferent. Mm-hmm. Yep. One of the interesting things, just to point out to you, that there are no centrioles in these nerve cells. So these cells do not undergo mitosis. So basically, nerves are the slowest healing of cells. We'll talk about how there is some healing that happens, and we'll talk about that when I see you again tomorrow. But they are very slow growing. Again, this cut that I had on my wrist that affected my right hand, that cut the nerve that goes up into my thumb. Again, this has been almost 30 years now, and it's still numb, like it's still tingly. Oh, I hit a window. I'll tell you the story more later. At this stage, no. There are nerves that will regenerate and heal, but in this case, no, it won't. Sure, basically the connection, right? Think of it as the connection between here and there, the sensory part in particular. The motor is fine, I can do that no problem, but that sensory nerve was affected, and again, I can feel, it just is that little pins and needle kind of tingly feeling when I rub onto it. Normally, I don't really notice it. Sure. We'll talk more about those, absolutely. There are differences in the type of sensory fibers, absolutely. We'll get to those. Yes?
How come sometimes when someone's paralyzed, it does come back?
Because there is growth. We used to think there was none, but there is actually some changes that do happen. Okay. But you're talking about within the first couple of years. Okay. Usually you got about a 2-year window-ish. Someone who's had a stroke, someone who has had a spinal cord injury like that, at least what they've said, is you're talking about a smaller window of time that you will get this regeneration, this growth, and if there's still deficits left over, it's probably not coming back.
And if you can transplant a heart, why can't you transplant a nerve?
That's a great question. Did y'all hear the question? She says, if we can transplant a heart, why can't we transplant a nerve? The easy answer for that is connections. Each of these nerves, particularly let's take the nerve that goes to my hand that's making me be able to move my fingers. There are almost literally millions of connections that you would have to somehow fix. So when I had the surgery, sure, they were trying to reconnect that nerve. And again, they got the motor I can do fine. But the piece of the sensory nerve just did not completely fully heal. Does that make sense? I heard Ben Carson was describing one time about brain surgery. Have you ever peeled an orange? You know, and you look at the orange, it's still got all that white stuff on it, right? He says, imagine that you took out a magnifying glass and you were trying to literally move every single piece of that white off of that orange. Because that's all still skin, you understand that, right? Remove every single piece, but don't possibly tear the surface that actually holds the juice inside. Like that was what his job was like, trying to remove these little pieces of brain tumor from the brain itself. Very detailed, so all those connections between, at that level, you're talking about microscopically, all the connections between these places, the synapses. Okay. So it could be done, not that it couldn't be done, just very, very tedious, very difficult. Yes?
Then how come, like, when you transplant a heart, like, the heart needs, like, the ANS, because it beats to the pacemaker,
So the heart can actually beat all by itself. It doesn't need, but it does. There is influence from those nerves. But these are bigger things. These are, like the vessels that go into the heart. These are larger. They can reconnect those. It's difficult, don't get me wrong, but it's not as intense as on the nerve, I would say.
So the reason my question, like, so if we putting something, if we did like a, test on the stomach, that still requires nerve. So
Absolutely.
How do they reconnect
from the cut end, the new end, you just will simply put them together and hope they will grow back. Yeah. I don't know, I'm not a neurosurgeon, so I don't know the details behind that, but my understanding is you just bring them together and you hope they grow back. Again, you can't make them grow. Yeah, we can make the conditions as best as we can, but the body has to heal. Yeah. Good, good, good. So the neurosoma we talked about. Whew. Our next piece is the dendrites. Dendrites is literally meaning tree branches, right? Because if you look at the picture of those dendrites, it looks like it's just roots or branches, right? This looks like a tree with no leaves on it, right? That's where this root of this word comes from. And these dendrites are where this neuron is connecting with another. So it's the receiving end of the neuron is the dendrite. And then the sending the signal end, that's the axon. And an axon of one nerve or one neuron would be connected to the dendrite of another. Does that make sense? That would be a synapse. Much more detail there. Those are the details that I wanted to make sure you knew. At the very end of those axons, you have this bulb, this termination, the axon terminal, which is where the synapse is. Again, that juncture between one neuron and another. And of course, that synapse is where all the neurotransmitters are. So here's that picture. Again, dendrites on the outside, the soma cell body, the axon that's moving. It can branch on the end to go to different neurons. And it's wrapped in these cells here, which we'll talk more about here, the Schwann cells. We're going to run out of time here for a moment. In a moment. There is a whole classification of the different types of neurons. Multipolar, bipolar, unipolar. I didn't want you to learn these. But are you comfortable that you've got one axon and multiple dendrites for a multipolar, which is like what they showed you on the picture? A bipolar is one axon, one dendrite. So I'm connected one here and one there. That's it. Unipolar, it's all one. The cell body is away, so the dendrite becomes the axon. And an axionic means it's all dendrites but no axons. So it's simply receiving pieces. There's a picture that shows you that. Again, you don't have to know this, but it is there. We'll continue with the supportive cells on the morrow. Adios.